In just a minute, what we're going to do is we're going to turn over and we're going to talk a bit about universal waste, which is under tab 7 in your materials. While we're waiting for that to come up, I can start talking about it quickly. Basically, what you want to know is that universal waste is a subset of hazardous waste. And if you flip over in the materials to the back of the first page, you'll see the quick regulatory overview in slide 2. The middle of the first page just talks about what we're going to cover. And then if you go to slide 4, which is the top of the second page, you've got a circle there that shows the universe of hazardous waste. Inside that is a smaller circle. Universal waste is a subset of hazardous waste. So the first key thing to know is that officially universal waste is hazardous waste. What you want to know is that as long as you manage it properly, you get to manage it in a way that decreases the regulations you need to comply with. But if you don't manage it properly, it defaults back to being hazardous waste. So it's important to try to stay within the appropriate regulations. Otherwise, you end up having to meet the higher burden. There we go. Okay. So again, real quick, this is something that was added about 12 years ago to the regulations, 13 years ago. And these are hazardous waste, but they're generated in large volumes. They're not particularly hazardous. This was an attempt to ease the regulatory burden. And it's also an attempt to promote proper recycling and treatment and disposal. So be mindful of that as we go through the regulations. There is not a lot to this program, but because of that, it's very clear and very easy to trip up if you don't do it right. But generally speaking, this is a fairly easy program to get a handle on. But because of that, it's very clear what the violations are at the same time. There are several designated waste streams that fall under universal waste. If you have mercury-containing lamps, batteries that contain heavy metals, mercury-containing thermostats, mercury-containing equipment, and unused pesticides. Does anybody know what an example of a mercury-containing lamp is? Aha! Look up and you will find one. Yes. Fluorescent bulbs.
Are the little things that homeowners get now considered that they need to be disposed of like that?
Yes, those compact fluorescent bulbs, those are fluorescent bulbs. Okay?
So what, you know, they're putting a lot of them out there, and the homeowners are throwing them in the trash.
Yes.
When you go out.
Very good question, and actually that raises a great question that somebody raised up during the break. You do certain things at home that you cannot do at work. You take a fluorescent bulb and you throw it in the trash at home. Unless your town says you're doing something wrong, EPA will not ever enforce against you as a homeowner. If you do the same thing at work, you get in trouble. You throw out certain hazardous materials in your trash, aerosol cans that are partially full at home, you're okay. Unless the town says you're in trouble. EPA will never go after you, but EPA will regulate against you in a commercial setting, in a business setting, such as your workplace. So we are held to two different standards. At home, a much lower standard, and at work, a much higher standard. And just know that the exact same action with the same exact material is covered very differently depending on whether you're at work or at home. So we're going to focus on each of these 5 areas. You should know that the states, just like in all the other programs, have the option of how they choose to regulate universal waste. In the case of Georgia, it has adopted exactly the same waste regulations as the EPA. This is talking about pesticides that are not restricted use pesticides. When we get to pesticides, which is in a whole module we're going to cover a little later in the training, there are 2 general categories of pesticides. General use pesticides and restricted use pesticides. This is talking about non-restricted use pesticides. And it's only talking about unused pesticides. If something is recalled, and we're going to get to what the definition of pesticides is a little later, so if you bear with me and hold your question for a minute, when we get to what each of these categories means, we're going to get into that in a little more detail. So again, Georgia has the same regulations. This is just reinforcing the concept that if you don't manage your universal waste properly, and it becomes if it's got a hazardous waste characteristic, then it is going to be a hazardous waste. So if you don't meet the regulations, you default to the higher burden of having to deal with it as a hazardous waste, and it's typically more expensive and more of a burden. Just like with hazardous waste, there are two levels of categories. There are levels of what are called waste handlers. You can be a large quantity or a small quantity. Large quantity is an entity, an institution that accumulates more than 5,000 kilograms. That's 11,000 pounds. That's a lot of universal waste. So unless you are a very large campus, most likely you are going to be a small quantity handler. Okay? Quick note, if you are a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, you have options for universal waste. You've got considerably more flexibility, just like you do for the hazardous waste regulations. By extension, you've got more flexibility for universal waste. You can take, if you're a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, you can take your universal waste to another universal waste handler, or you can take it to a facility. You have options on whether or not you want to comply with any of the other requirements. You don't have to label, you don't have to date, you don't have to meet the requirements. You can if you want to, but you're not required to. So just like with hazardous waste, the key thing to remember is that a conditionally exempt small quantity generator has options that are imposed as a requirement on large and small quantity generators. This is just a quick chart that shows the distinctions, some of the distinctions between large quantity and small quantity handlers. So small quantity handlers, again, less than 5,000 kilograms. If that's all you're generating, you don't need an EPA number. You don't need to manifest. You just have to train to make sure that employees who are working with this have proper handling and emergency procedure awareness. If you are a large quantity handler, again, over 11,000 pounds, you do need a number. You do need to keep basic shipping records. It can be a bill of lading. It doesn't have to be a manifest, but you have to have some proof of shipment, and you do need to have more sophisticated training. And the answer is no. They're two separate, distinct calculations.
Unless you mess up.
Unless you mess up. And do you need, is the EPA ID number going to, can the EPA ID number be the same? And the answer is yes. Your EPA generator number can be the same. When you are shipping off just universal waste, you do not need a manifest at all. So you don't have the same requirements. If you're a small quantity handler, you don't need any manifest or any proof of shipment. If you are a large quantity handler, then you need some kind of basic shipping record, like a bill of lading. You could use a manifest, but you don't have to. You also, if you're a small quantity handler, could have a manifest, but you're not required to.
But it's good to have one.
It's good to have one because it shows you how much you're generating and that you're well under the threshold. But again, this is universal waste only as opposed to hazardous waste that we're talking about at this moment. So looking at some of the different types of categories, and we're going to march through each of them, the different categories, what falls into and what falls out of each of the categories of what we're going to talk about for universal waste. For batteries that have heavy metals in them, so nickel cadmium, metal hydride, lead acid batteries are all considered to be universal waste. What is not are your typical batteries, your typical alkaline flashlight type batteries. You can manage them as universal waste, but they are not officially universal waste. They can be thrown in the trash. It's not a bad idea to recycle them, but you don't have to handle them as universal waste. You also, as long as you are taking your lead acid batteries that are managed through the battery deposit system, which is for your typical car batteries, those are not needing to be handled as universal waste. Again, the assumption is you're going to handle them safely. They're going to be swapped out and returned to the place that you got them from. That takes them out of this requirement. However, if you fail to do that, then you have to handle them appropriately as hazardous waste. So that's batteries. Lamps, okay, your typical fluorescent lamps, high intensity discharge, neon, mercury vapor, are all eligible for universal waste treatment as long as you handle them properly. Quick question, what if you have a green tip bulb? Okay, right, okay. That's unfortunately the right answer. The green tip bulbs have been marketed as being safe and as being environmentally friendly. The sad fact, unfortunately, is that when they've been tested, when they've been T-clipped, that TCLP test that we talked about, sometimes they pass, but a lot of times they fail. So my best advice to everybody is, unfortunately, until they come up with an absolute guarantee that they are safe to be handled as solid waste to be thrown in the trash, you have to manage them as universal waste. We're talking about intact bulbs here only. If it breaks, then it has to be handled as hazardous waste. Okay, because then the assumption is that the mercury is dissipating into the atmosphere, and then you've got a spill and you've got to deal with it as a hazardous waste.
By the time you get over there, it's all gone.
I agree with you. I absolutely know that that's true, but that's what the regulations call for. The truth is, you're right. By the time you get there, the issue's dissipated already. There are bulb grinders that allow you to take the bulbs, crunch them up. At that point, the minute you break them, what's broken is a hazardous waste. So you've got to do a pretty careful cost analysis to determine whether or not it's worth it to run those or not. They are allowed. As a general matter, they're probably, in my personal opinion, not a very good idea. But if you have them, just know that the contents is hazardous at that point. The minute you break the bulb, it's a hazardous waste. It's no longer a universal waste. You are allowed to operate them, and so just do a cost-benefit analysis as to whether or not it's worth it to do that. Mercury-containing devices, waste thermostats, you've got to handle them as universal waste. Your thermostats, your sphygmomanometers, blood pressure cuffs, if they have mercury in them. You should know that if you can remove the little mercury ampule in a way that prevents breakage, at that point then you're okay. Pesticides. Here's where we get to the question that was raised before about pesticides. Here we are talking about pesticides that are unused and that have been recalled. They've been suspended or canceled. So we're limiting the kinds of pesticides that we're talking about here. And if the used pesticides are hazardous, then they've got to be managed in accordance with hazardous waste regulations. So again, just the fact that it is pesticides is not enough. You've got to check to see, A, if it's been recalled, B, if it's unused, and making sure that it's not a restricted use pesticide. So now we've talked a little bit about the kinds of materials that might qualify to be universal waste. What are the requirements? And there are really fundamentally two requirements that you always want to be thinking about. First is you've got to make sure you date each item or the container. Universal waste has to be dated. You're not allowed to hold a universal waste item for more than a year. You can keep a log where you can date each item, where you can date each container. Okay? The easiest approach is to date each item if it's a big item, or to date each container when the first item is placed in the container. So if you've got a box of used bulbs, the minute the first bulb goes in that box, put a label on it, put a date on it. This way you can say that the oldest bulb in the box has not been sitting for more than 1 year. All right? You've got to have a date on every single container. If the bulb is still in the fixture, then it's not,
whether it works or not.
Whether it works or not, I would say it's not a waste yet, although the minute you should be taking it out of the fixture and you get into that gray area of whether or not you're going to make a determination that it's a waste because the building's unused, the fixture doesn't work, or the light bulb doesn't work, you've got a pretty good argument that it probably is a waste and that it probably should be taken down, and you're probably in violation. But the quick rule of thumb is if it's still in the fixture, we're generally not going to focus on it. Okay? Usually there are plenty of instances where you've got loose bulbs sitting in the corner somewhere that are enough to focus on. But officially, you're right. It's a very good question. So again, always be thinking about making sure that there is a date. You can have a log, but it's a lot easier to just slap a label on each of those containers. Make sure you meet that requirement. And this is true for every single waste stream that's a universal waste stream. couple of quick examples here. Who thinks that these are managed properly? Okay. Anybody know what the issues are? Open containers. Container that's not the right size. Bulbs that are not in a container at all. I'm sorry? Yes. Okay. When you're talking about lamp storage, there are a couple of requirements. In addition to always needing to put a date on the container, you must do several other things. The lamps have to be in containers that are closed. They have to be structurally sound and adequate to prevent some breakage. And there has to be no evidence that there's been leakage or spillage. Okay, so again, maybe in the box, but it's not a box that's the appropriate length. Here's a box that's open. Here are bulbs that are not in the box at all. Again, because this is a fairly easy program in the sense that there's a limited number of things you have to think about, it's one that the regulators will hit you for fairly hard because it is so clear. You need that date. You need the closed container for bulbs. You need to make sure that it's labeled with the appropriate words, which we're going to get to in a second. Okay? You must have, in addition to the date, these magic words. It has to say universal waste lamps, waste lamps, used lamps. It's got to say something. These pre-labeled, these pre-manufactured purple labels are easily available if you wanted to buy them, or you can make them up for your campus. But you must have labels, and they have to have those magic words on them, and make sure you've got the start date. Okay? Any issues here? No label. Not a good idea. Just a couple of best management practices. You don't want to stack them too high. You generally want to try to store them indoors. Here's a question about breakage. We were talking before about lamps that broke, lamps that break. If the lamp breaks while it's being placed in the container or after it's in the container, that's called incidental storage, incidental breakage, sorry. And in that case, it's not considered to be a hazardous waste. But you do have to seal up the container and not add any more lamps to it. So if it breaks in the process of trying to store it properly, then it's not considered to be hazardous waste. Talk for a minute about battery and battery storage. You need to make sure that they're managed in a way that won't allow them to be released. And they don't have to be stored in a container unless they show evidence of a leak. In this case, you've got batteries, it's a little hard to see here, that are on a pallet. One of them was leaking, and so it's not a good situation. So when you've got a battery that is leaking, then you need to make sure that is in a container. Otherwise, the batteries are presumed to be safe all by themselves. They do have to be labeled, they do have to be dated, but they do not have to be in any kind of a container. Yes. Unless, well, if you were talking about a car battery and you're swapping it out as part of the regular battery car exchange, then you're outside of this program altogether. Okay, if you look back in the materials a little bit under the definition of batteries, what's covered and what's not covered, you don't have to worry about batteries that are being exchanged as part of a regular car battery exchange. Just like with the lamps, you need to make sure that each battery or each container of batteries is labeled. And these are the magic words. You need to have one of these phrases on there. And again, you always have to have that date as well. But you need to have, it doesn't have to be this exact label, but it has to have some kind of a label on it. It's got to have those magic words.
So if you use that label, you need battery on there, right?
Yes, so you'd have to put contents, battery or waste battery or used battery. You'd have to fill that in, and you'd have to fill in the start date. Okay? If you have enough of them, you could pre-print up that say on them lamps or batteries, but you do have to designate what it is. You've got to have these words. So by having the words universal waste automatically on there, you're halfway there. You just have to fill in the contents. Again, it's better to store these inside. It's better to store them on a pallet or a container, although you don't have to, but if they're large batteries, it's a good idea to. You can have some kind of a pail to accumulate a whole number of batteries if that's an easier way to do it. In terms of pesticides, again, limited to the kinds of pesticides that qualify for universal waste. They have to be in a container that's closed, that's structurally sound, and that's compatible. They also have to be labeled. Okay, again, you see the common theme. There's always got to be a date. There's always got to be a label for each kind of waste stream. Again, generally a very good idea as a best management practice to store them indoors in a secured area and to handle spills only through someone that's trained to address them properly. Mercury-containing devices, similar to lamps, they've got to be stored in containers that are closed, that are structurally sound, that are compatible, that don't have any evidence of leakage. Quick question, back in the waste storage area that we saw today, I don't know if anybody noticed a small bucket on the floor, 2 small buckets on the floor. Did anybody notice what was in those? Thermometers, mercury thermometers. Were they intact or broken?
Good question.
Good question. Some of them look like they could have been broken. If they were intact, then they weren't labeled properly. If they were broken, then they definitely were hazardous waste. So, something just to be thinking about and looking for. But either way, they weren't stored properly. Okay, again, same kind of concept here for the mercury thermostats, mercury devices. You want to make sure that they are labeled properly. Mercury-containing devices, same thing. If you have a break, a release, what do? Aha. All right, now we're talking here about something other than the incidental breakage as part of packaging up the bulbs. You've got to clean it up, call campus personnel for assistance. If something is broken, then it's got to be put in a closed container and stored properly. I absolutely agree with the comment that the minute a bulb breaks, probably the risk has already gone up into the atmosphere for the most part. But this is what is required to be done. You still have to consider it to be hazardous waste and treat it properly. Okay? You have to determine whether or not it exhibits enough of a characteristic to be treated as a hazardous waste. If there's enough residue of mercury there that it fails the TCLP test, or it's sufficient to trip you into having sufficient quantities of mercury, then you have to consider it to be a hazardous waste. Questions about universal waste. What to do, what to think about, how to handle them. My quick observation, without pointing the finger at any particular campus here, is that in many campuses that's not happening. Not consistently. Just like with the hazardous waste rules, when you are adding or taking out material from the container, you can have it open. Otherwise, you're supposed to have it closed at all times. So is it a burden? Absolutely. Is it a bit of a pain? Does it slow down the folks that are dealing with the lamps? Yes. But that's a trade-off. You've got to be in compliance. Why don't they do it? Because it slows them down a little bit. But unfortunately, you have to get them to comply with the regulations. That's the bottom line. But it is an issue, and I understand why they rush and why they're not as likely to always be in compliance. But that's an education question, a training question that the campuses have to deal with. You need to have training, yes. It's not very detailed training, but the requirements are that you have to have enough training to know what the requirements are. So it's it can be done in-house. It's a fairly general, not a very high bar to meet, but what the EPA would say and what an auditor might say is that if I'm walking around and seeing consistently that bulbs are left in a corner, they're not labeled, they're not dated, they're not stored in the proper containers, your training program is either not effective or you're not doing the training. Okay, so it's not that you have to prove it, but the proof is more in the pudding, if you will. If you can demonstrate that consistently people are understanding the requirements, then your training's probably going on and it's effective. Otherwise, it's probably not. All right, a quick recap for today then, in terms of universal waste. The key things to think about are that you want to make sure that your containers are being managed properly, that you're dating them, and that you're labeling them. If you don't do that, then the worst is that EPA will tell you that they are hazardous waste and that they're going to cite you for failing to handle a hazardous waste properly. So it's not a very complicated program, but again, you have to be able to show that you're complying with the requirements. Otherwise, you're going to fall into that more heavily regulated category. All right? And then if you have lamp breakage, you want to make sure you handle that properly. But the two big things are that you want to make sure that you're dating and labeling properly, and that where it's appropriate for lamps, for mercury-containing devices, that they're stored in closed containers. All right? Those are the key things that I want you to take away in terms of universal waste. Again, like with the other materials, you've got a set of audit procedures in the materials. You've got a checklist in the materials to help you remember what to look for as you're auditing. And conversely, as you go back to your campuses, things to look for to try to make sure that your campus is in compliance. So again, it's not a lot to think about, but because it's so clear, it's a pretty easy program to get tripped up on, in part because so much of it is managed by staff whose job is not primarily to keep the campus in compliance, but whose job is primarily to make sure the campus is being well lit. And so that's not their primary focus necessarily. So it's a question of coordinating and working together with them. The EPA started out having just a category for mercury-containing devices, and at some point they broke out thermostats separately. It's not exactly clear to me what the real distinction is a lot of the time, so you could probably combine the two together. But officially there are two separate categories. It's not much of a distinction between the two. Okay? Very good question. In terms of hazardous waste training, the requirement is that you take an initial training and that you take an annual refresher training. And again, this is for people who are actively working in the hazardous waste program. We're not talking about research staff in the lab who are only managing their satellite accumulation area. We're talking about staff who are signing manifests, who are inspecting and working in the main accumulation area. There is a requirement that you have annual refresher training. And that is a requirement that the EPA looks for each year. I have asked the EPA staff sometimes if it really is a requirement, if you've gone through it 8 times, why you have to go through the 9th time. And the answer I've gotten back from my colleagues there is that some of them have been taking this for 20 years. And they go through and they take it every year. That's the requirement.
That is if you are in large quantity.
That is if you were a large or small quantity generator. Again, this is not for conditionally exempt quantity generators because all the requirements, just about all the requirements drop out for them. That we're talking about large quantity generators. The question is, if you ship it directly from the satellite area, is there any time limit or clock involved? And the answer is no. Because when it's in a satellite area, as long as it stays in the satellite area and it's managed properly, and you're not above that threshold of 55 gallons or 1 quart of pea waste, you can keep it there for as long as you want, as long as it's managed properly. The clock only starts to tick if you decide to move it to that central accumulation area. You can arrange with a transporter to have it picked up directly from the satellite accumulation area if you want to. Most campuses don't want to do that because it's considerably more expensive to have a contractor walk around and pick up waste from every satellite area, but in theory you could do that if you wanted to. There is a small exception to the rule that if you are shipping your waste more than 200 miles away, you actually have 270 days for as a small quantity generator to ship off your waste. If you can prove definitively that your waste is always going more than 200 miles, you can take advantage of that. It's a proposition that you want to weigh carefully because if you're not shipping it more than 200 miles, then you trip yourself up that way. But you can take advantage of that small exception to the rule if you can show consistently that your waste hauler is shipping it more than 200 miles away. Okay? Let me answer one last question, which I know was raised before, which has to do with lead paint. And the question came up as to whether or not if you have a summer camp and you've got people who are staying at the campus for less than 100 days, only for the summer, but they've got children under 6 who are spending time there, is it considered to be housing or is it considered to be a child facility? Well, the quick answer that I thought of is that you've actually got two separate requirements. You've got to look at each of them independently. And I wasn't really focusing on this earlier in the training, but you want to look at each of them separately. So for the housing, if you are renting housing to somebody for one-time use only for less than 100 days, then you qualify for that exemption, that exception to the rule, and you don't have to worry about making sure that they get the appropriate notice. However, if you've got children who are spending time in the building more than 3 hours a day, more than 2 days a week, at least 60 hours a year, then it's considered to be a child-occupied facility, and then you've got to make sure that you meet the appropriate requirements in terms of notice and any renovation work and any other work that goes on there for a child facility. So you really want to look at those two requirements separately. In that example, it was an interesting situation where they blurred together, but what you want to do is tease them both apart and think about them each separately.